and it is my pleasure to welcome you once again as the Atlantic Council navigates you through the IMF World Bank 2025 annual meetings. This is our first event of a series of over 50 events throughout the week. You can find the full agenda on our website, but we always start, as is tradition, on the eve of the meetings with our all-star senior fellows. Welcome back. Thank you for being here. I want to introduce Nicole Golden, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, Head, Equitable Development, UNU Center for Policy Research. Martin Mulheisen, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, former Director of Strategy, Policy and Review at the IMF, and Hung Tran, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, former Deputy Director, Monetary and Capital Markets. Hung, Martin, Nicole, another meetings.
Here we are.
Here we go again.
But an upgraded set coming to you live from IMF HQ2. And I'm going to start with you, Nicole. We're going to give the bank the honor here. And
well then.
ask you what's on your agenda that we should watch for the week.
Well, thanks. It's great to be back with my friends and colleagues here. And I will say the one thing I did notice is one thing to watch is on the more limited but still signage outside is the World Bank Group on top of the International Monetary Fund.
They do
on
the
the
flip,
main time.
right?
They did a little flip. So for the world bankers out there, that was nice to see. But lots to watch for. I mean, this is going to be an interesting meeting. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. One thing that I'm particularly watching for is the timing this year. We are coming off the heels of the big Financing for Development Summit in Sevilla in July, and debt and fiscal space issues continue to be at the fore. I think that's something I'm certainly going to be watching for to see what happens there. And what it is looking like in the sort of broad landscape of development finance, development cooperation. Lots of questions around what that looks and feels like and how do we move forward. So those are going to be, I think, permeating into both the official and the unofficial conversations that we're seeing. So those are just a couple of the top things, and then some others.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned development assistance and finance. I mean, this is a different world that we come into in these meetings than the annual meetings a year ago. Yeah. And that's because of all the significant policy changes we've seen here out of Washington, and that will be the backdrop to so much of these meetings.
I mean, absolutely. And, it had started before the spring meetings, and we started this conversation then. But as I said, it's really continuing. And we're seeing that in terms of how the conversation around, like I said, around debt and fiscal space, what that means for private capital mobilization, what that means for things like credit ratings, and some of the other kinds of different instruments and all of the other different factors that are playing into what this sort of future of both bilateral as well as multilateral assistance and sort of financial cooperation is going to look like.
Thanks, Nicole. Martin, over to you. You just wrote a piece. It's live on the Atlantic Council website on Iconographics blog, and encourage everyone to check it out, and our live blog edited by Catherine Golden on our team, which will be updated throughout the week with our analysis. But tell us, on your mind, the top themes to watch for this week.
Sure. Good to be back. Nice new setting. I was kidding earlier that we could also start discussing Premier League games while we're talking.
We have the right setup.
But okay, let's come back. One shouldn't expect too much in terms of multilateral announcements, a great communique or the like. I'm sure there will be a chairman statement again, but I think the real issue is if you think back half a year ago, when it was very uncertain what position the US would take vis-a-vis the IMF and the World Bank. We have a bit more clarity on that yet because, in part, the US has now worked with the IMF to extend a swap line, as they call it, to Argentina. And you also see other ways of them cooperating, the appointment of a new first deputy managing director, for example. But still, I'm sure many delegates will come here to ask, so what is the deal between the US and the IMF and the World Bank, for that matter? How will the US Treasury, how will the White House look at these institutions now that they made some initial commitments? And the big question is, I think, in my view, will the US try to do it collaboratively in the sense of listening also to these institutions when it comes to country cases like Argentina? What conditions should be applied, what should be the lending sequence and the like? Or is it going to be the other way around, that the US has expectations for the institutions and you better do what we say? And that could then, of course, raise a lot of questions because the US doesn't have a majority, although it has a blocking minority in the board. So there would have to be difficult discussions. So we'll see. That's a big issue, I think, going into these meetings.
It's interesting you say that because when we met 6 months ago, that was the question on everyone's mind. How does Secretary Bessent, how does the Trump administration want to engage with the Bretton Woods institutions? And then 6 months ago, he gave the speech, which I think a lot of people at this institution, and I think at the bank as well, basically took as a sign of, well, the U.S. wants reform and changes, but they're engaged. But I wonder from your perspective, is that the end of the story? Because I think internally there was a lot of sigh of relief, but I'm not sure that we've fully understood what engagement will look like going forward.
Well, like in many other policy areas, I think the Trump administration is implementing what they can in terms of the legal situation. They're going to go right to the border of what is legal and not. I'm not saying they're going to do that with the IMF, but they have a lot of ways to influence the developments here. And I think what they will do is they will have a strong relationship with their new FDMD, with the new First Deputy Managing Director.
Who was Secretary Bessent's right-hand man at Treasury, yes.
So I would expect that this tough love approach that they had in their speeches, commitment to the institutions, but at the same time they really need to do their work, that will shine through more in this second term. And how this is going to play out, I said earlier, we'll have to see. But I would expect a much more hands-on role for the U.S. in these institutions.
Yeah, and everyone should be prepared for that. Hung, over to you. You wrote a piece for us last week, a scene setter. Everyone should check it out on the Atlantic Council website, the 5 themes to look for. I want to ask you what those 5 are, and I also want to talk to you about something that changed since you wrote the piece, which are the events over the weekend between the U.S. and China and the potential reemergence of trade wars, and then perhaps a step back from that cliff over the weekend.
So before I go through the 5 themes quickly, I just pick up the tail of the discussion that you and Martin had. Basically, in the spring meeting, everyone was concerned about whether or not the U.S. remained engaged with the IMF and World Bank. This time around, like you two point out, people want to understand better how the U.S. want the fund and the bank align themselves with U.S. policy. Has been enough what the two institutions have done so far in terms of downplaying, mentioning about climate finance, gender equality, inclusion, growth, and so on? Will the U.S. say, fine, that's enough? Or will the U.S. press for more alignment or more compliance with U.S. policy, which can be, if we see what happened in this country, which can be a big issue for the fund and the bank to cope with. So that is what I try to understand and see throughout the next few days. So back to the 5 themes. Number 1 is what I have not seen in the managing director curtain-raising speech a week ago, and that is how the fund, through the World Economic Outlook, which we will discuss tomorrow.
Stay tuned tomorrow afternoon.
Really address and advise members to deal with 2 things. One, short-term, the concentration risk of relying too much on artificial intelligence activities to drive the economy and stock markets. And second, the possible delay effects of tariffs. We haven't seen much so far, but that doesn't mean that tariffs won't have any impact on the economy, and how that will play out in a possible scenario of a mild stagflation, what countries should do. But more importantly, what countries should do being squeezed between U.S. protectionism on the one hand and Chinese mercantilism on the other hand, which is to be more intractable, more difficult to deal. So I look forward to see how the WEO and the discussion address that. And then another issue is Argentina, which we will discuss more later on. How is the relationship between U.S. or IMF, who is on the driver's seat in terms of addressing the need of a member country? And if it is the IMF, what the IMF should do, being the fact that Argentina is already the largest single exposure that the IMF has. 23 packages over the past
23,
decade.
yeah.
So what should it be? We would change the conditionality to make the program more socially and politically acceptable to the population, or should it double down on the current program? So that is what I'm looking at. But one thing I pick up from talking to staff and officials at the fund is that we may have a good chance for the global debt restructuring roundtable discussion this time to make some small but concrete progress in my view, and that is to propose that the debt negotiation should take place in parallel between debtor country and the official creditors and private sector creditors at the same time, instead of being in sequential discussion at the moment. And that will help reduce the delay and the timing of the whole debt restructuring process. So a few things to look at, but basically expectation is low. So the key thing I'm left with is really what can or should one expect in a low expectation meeting.
What can one expect in a low expectation meeting? That's a question we'll have to come back to at the end of the meetings, because
Right.
sometimes they surprise on the
Sometimes they say
upside.
that.
So we will look at that. So debt, AI, trade, of course the issues with Argentina. But Nicole, from the bank side, there's one word which dominates the bank's agenda: jobs, jobs, jobs. I feel like I'm on a political campaign here.
Exactly, and we are picking up right where April left off as the official theme. The annuals, we don't have as much of an official theme, but there it is. I mean, if you look at these, and again, the official agenda from the bank side, it's jobs in ag, it's jobs in AI, it's jobs in the private sector, it's jobs this way and that way. And again, there's a good reason for that. I mean, there is jobs we're seeing, again, on that kind of development finance fiscal space side. Along with debt, there is an increased focus on the domestic resource mobilization question, the supply side of that and the jobs piece of that, and mobilizing the sort of the tax base and getting more people into work. There's a reason for that. But it's also just seeing a big piece of the agenda as being really sort of moving forward. And going back to the point about, you know, how the U.S. Is or isn't aligned, or how the institutions aren't aligned. I mean, I think one of the things that we'll also be watching for on the bank side is, you may have seen, Ajay has recently announced another, if you will, a kind of reorganization, another streamlining. He has been very focused on the plumbing and on efficiencies, and this is another step in that direction. So I think putting the jobs agenda so forward is as a way to kind of bring the other pieces, the electricity, the AI, the private sector, around an agenda that is seen as unifying and as a way to kind of bring some of these issues forward.
So Martin, I want to turn to you because I'm struck by the conversation we're having, which is a pretty sort of standard conversation,
Yeah.
right? We could have had a version of this conversation 2 years ago, which is these are the issues on the agenda. We're talking debt. Wouldn't have talked about AI as much 2 years ago, but trade, of course, has risen on the agenda. There's some things that are not on the agenda, but the ministers and the governors are going to be talking about central bank independence, for example. I mean, there's some things that have fundamentally changed in the way this country operates, the U.S. operates, the largest shareholder, than when we've met before. What are the things not on the official agenda that the ministers will be talking about this week?
Well, that is one, as you said. I don't think, though, that this is really a multilateral conversation. Again, it may be between delegates. The Fed is here, of course. Again, trade will be, to some extent, discussed at the meetings, but the trade ministers are not here. So I think everybody will stick to the remits that they have and try to gather as much information as they can and do as much progress as they can. It's going to be marginal, I think, in, like you mentioned, the debt sustainability framework, restructuring framework. There is, I'm sure, some work ongoing at the IMF too, some work streams that will make incremental progress. We'll see board papers come out. But the big things, I think, will have to await further meetings. So next year, maybe we'll know a bit more. For example, will the US again turn to Congress to ratify the latest quota agreement with the objective, in their view, of reducing the role of China and other countries as a lender to the IMF in extremis? I mean, we're talking about a replacement of the new arrangements to borrow a good deal of it with the new quota share, which is permanent capital for the IMF. So it may be on the agenda. The Trump administration already surprised last time in the first term with a quota increase, with a NAB increase, sorry. And so there are some policy issues that can proceed that are in everybody's interest, but really the room of these policies has been shrinking.
That's a good way to put it. Nicole, you want to jump back
I just
in?
want to pick up on that really quick, and it relates back to the development finance and development cooperation point, which is, I think one of the other things that I'm watching for is not only what the finance ministers are saying, but which ones and who is speaking. Even the slate that you mentioned, Josh, of who's going to be at the Atlantic Council, I think there is going to be some interesting country representatives that we haven't necessarily heard from. And that, I think, is part of this conversation. We are hearing voices, different voices. The space for leadership has opened. And I think we're seeing other countries starting to step in. So that's another sort of piece of this puzzle that I'm on both sides of 19th Street that I'm watching to see is not only what people are saying, but who's saying it. Are we hearing from different people? Are we hearing different things out of some of the cast of characters? And that's, new leaders emerging from the global south, as well as from other maybe smaller countries, the middle powers conversation that I know, Hung and I have been having as well.
No, I think that's right. Trump has shaken things up in a way. And then 6 months ago, what I sensed was everyone was a little bit in wait and see mode. They wanted to engage quietly with the administration. Now people want to say, here's where I stand, here's where my country stands, and here's how I think I can benefit the U.S. But it's bilateral, as Martin said, not multilateral, which cuts against some of the premise of these institutions in the first place. Hung, we mentioned Argentina, but it's worth a deeper dive on this issue because single most important program at the IMF, and now you have the U.S. stepping in and providing a lifeline to Argentina in advance of their midterm elections at the end of this month. Who knows what will happen, but we could be in a very precarious situation come 3 or 4 weeks from now, both here at the fund and at Treasury.
But before I get to that, can I follow up with the two discussion here? In terms of development finance, what I'm really eager to see is what the fund and the bank can come up with concrete ideas how to compensate for a 25% reduction in official development assistance over the past 2 years. That's huge.
People's lives at stake.
And it's not just the US, it's not just President Trump. It is US, UK, Netherlands, Europe, and many countries. So far, what I have seen is really the old, tired ideas. Mobilizing funding from the private sector. Good luck. Good luck because it has not happened and it will not happen, particularly for the low-income countries. Things like countries have to do more to mobilize domestic resources. Great. Raise the tax revenue to GDP ratio to 15%. Correct. Spend wisely. Correct. But it's not easy to do. Countries are in the dire circumstances they are because of many reasons going back many years. They cannot just change it. So far, tired, old, traditional recipe, correct, but really not useful, and nothing new to replace or to compensate for the loss in ODA. In terms of quota, I think that talk about quota reform, which is a typical traditional topic at each fund and bank meetings, probably will be absent this time around.
Just wait for the next meeting.
Wait for the next meeting. See
and
what
and
will
when
happen.
does a decision have to be made? Is it
CSU,
a year from now?
Staff, no, end of this year, 2025, staff has to present to the board a proposal to do a new formula to calculate quota and proposal how to redistribute it. But I don't think that report will see the light of anytime soon.
It wouldn't be the first report on this topic.
Martin's seen a few of those.
So back to your question, Argentina. Basically, the problem Argentina has, despite all the positive achievement that President Milei has been able to do, reducing fiscal deficit from deficit to surplus, reducing inflation, some growth, is the fact that the key to his program is to keep the stable rate stable, so as to reduce inflation and prevent inflation from rising. Nevertheless, inflation in Argentina from 3-digit to less than 40%. 40% is still higher than any other countries, and therefore the exchange rate continues to be appreciating on a real term trade-weighted basis. And the overvaluation of the peso has always been the trigger of poor trade performance, poor export performance, current account deficit, and also requiring the government, the central bank, to use dollar reserve to support the currency. And now they will use US support to stabilize the currency. But if they stabilize the currency, they will continue to have the problem of overvaluation.
Well, that's the question I want to ask you both about here. I just don't understand if the lifeline's coming, but they're not floating the exchange rate. They've said they can stay within this band that Malaya has been so focused on, and there was some debate whether the money would come with strings attached. So far, at least publicly, it doesn't seem like that's the case.
Yeah, but it's not that easy and cost-free to just free up the currency.
Of course.
Because if you free up the currency, you say we don't have the ban anymore, currency will go down, inflation will go up, and the whole thing. So they are caught in a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
We're back where we were like, when was it, 4 or 6 years ago under the Macri government. It was the same situation.
2018, and
Yeah.
I remember this
That,
well.
yeah, that led to the stop of the program because they just simply couldn't.
This is when Argentina had the G20, I remember.
Yes, yeah. So it's the issue. I mean, what comes on top of all that is the elections, right? There's traditionally some outflows before the elections because people are cautious about the outcome. And then this puts pressure on the peso, downward pressure, and then the administration responds, and then they start using exchange reserves, and then the whole cycle goes up. So maybe the U.S. intervention works this time if they use real money, but I think the problem of Argentina is still this kind of deep-seated inability to generate long-term, strong, sustained growth. And that has not only to do with this government, it's a legacy from many, many Peronist governments in the past and others. But it will take a long time to repair. And in fact, what you would really need, and some other program countries of the IMF have achieved that, is you need to have a societal consensus between the major parties. But they have such a deep polarization there that it's going to be hard to build something within a legislation period that is not going to be taken apart by the next government. So if there's no stability in politics and if there's no consensus, well, the risk is in this case that they are foreign debt to multilaterals and the US, both creditors that you can't really default against, will just continue to go up. And that's my concern with the US intervention. If it works, great, then they've made a great contribution. Ideally, as I said earlier, they should coordinate conditionality and help the IMF enforce it, because the voice of the Treasury in Argentina is probably a little bit stronger than if just the IMF mission chief comes and says, you've got to do ABC, right? So there is room for coordination. I wrote about that I think in the run-up to Marrakesh. If big shareholders work with the IMF to implement programs to success, everybody wins. But it may not happen. And then if there's a huge amount of debt outstanding next year, then who's gonna pay first? Who's gonna be paid first? And is then the IMF forced not to roll over not only its own loan, but also the one of the US? That would be too much, I think, to ask. So it's a very delicate situation.
Two things I want to add quickly. One, I think that if the aim of the US assistance to Argentina is well-defined and short-term, it may succeed in the sense that you just need to buy 2 weeks' time for the currency to be fairly stable. If you can do that to support the chance of the Milei party in the October 26 election, then that you can call it a successful intervention. Short 2 weeks time, boom. However, if it lingers longer and afterward we still have the ban, we still have the overvaluation problem, then it will be really open-ended. It's not clear. So if it is short-term focus, it has a chance. But if it's not that, then it's really very iffy. Second point, Argentina also has the honor and the distinction as the only country that have 2 swap lines at the same time. One from the US, $20 billion, one from China, $18 billion, which was originated by the previous government, which is a little bit more friendly to China. But Milei himself extended the Chinese line earlier this year. So, interesting fact.
I'm glad you raised that because the whole premise of our work here at the Atlantic Council is the intersection of geopolitics and economics. And you can't get away from it when you have a country like Argentina with swap lines with China and the US. And that will play out in the months ahead. There's no doubt. Nicole, I want to turn back to you. you know, I've been thinking about different meetings. There were years we came in and said, these are the debt meetings. And there were years we came in and said, this is the digital asset meetings. As a year ago, or we're going to talk crypto and stablecoins, which of course will be talked about again this year. But I feel listening to Kristalina's speech and some of the things Ajay said in advance, these are the AI meetings, right? We're going to talk about AI. And Kristalina said this in her speech. AI can create jobs, not cost jobs. How? Isn't this the fundamental question for the U.S. but for all economies right now?
Absolutely. I mean, it can create. I think where the creation can come in is in a couple ways. It's in the complementarity. It's in the tech-human interface. And it is also in the industry itself. And then, of course, there is the displacement. One of the areas that sort of I've been working on is we hear a lot, again, especially on the World Bank side, about we're still hearing about the demographic dividend, which is a topic we love to talk about. And you know, we've moved from speaking about it only in the youth, in the sort of young countries, but also we have an aging. This was part of the April WEO, the chapter 2 on the sort of longevity economy and the opportunities there. And so what I've been sort of thinking about is how do we, now we take that to the digital demographic dividend. So how do we think about AI in a contextual sense as it relates to jobs and strategy and policy? I think one of the challenges is, like with a lot of technologies, there's a kind of rush to deploy, a rush to adopt. Obviously, we've seen AI grow more rapidly than arguably any other kind of technology modern era. But it is contextual. We know that there's obviously space in the global south. There's to widen the digital gap as opposed to sort of narrow it, given the lack of compute or the energy resources that are needed to generate the AI, to the language issues around sort of feeding the models. So, you know, there's questions around how do you use small AI, if you will, to support jobs and support informal economies as well, or support farmers and agriculture to not only, you know, create jobs, but also just revenue and earnings. And I think that's the other piece of it, and that sort of AI and jobs conversation is about broader kind of earnings. How can AI support not just employment, but businesses and the whole kind of economic ecosystem and economic participation? We talk about it in terms of financial inclusion when we think about the global majority work and how AI can support potential sort of, you know, credit access and enabling credit ratings and you know, credit history. So I think there's lots of different aspects of it, but yeah, I mean, I think, you know, again, the worry is that those that the displacement will come are those where the jobs are already at a disadvantage. So
just a few minutes left,
Yeah.
and I want to talk for a minute and pick up somewhere where you left off, Nicole, on farmers and the U.S. economy while we're here sitting in the United States, because the U.S. economy is in a stronger position than I think many predicted, including some of us at the Atlantic Council 6 months ago at the onset of Liberation Day and the trade war. Inflation's still a little higher than the Fed wants, but growth is still a little stronger, but jobs are stagnating in the U.S. And I wanted to ask you, Martin, how you think the WEO is going to address this tomorrow. So this is always a tough question to ask you for your prediction hours before the WEO comes out. But as always, a tricky forecast.
Yeah, well, I mean, the fund has always been good, especially in the WEO, to explain what has happened the last couple of months and years.
Yeah.
They've not been so great in forecasting, but you know, that's imminent. I mean, that's part of the system. But I mean, the way I see it is there's been a lot of investment in AI, yes, but also others. I mean, some of these trade deals, they involve investment. Also, companies are concerned that they may be cut off from a huge market, so they better produce here. So there's been all that. But let's not forget, the fiscal policy is still on steroids, and it's not like the fiscal impulse is getting bigger and bigger, but it's not declining either, and the deficit is high, and that keeps increasing, and we're seeing that possibly at some point in long-term interest rates. In fact, they're already up. So we shouldn't kind of minimize the role of AI. I think it's big, but we also should not overestimate it. And at the moment, it doesn't do a lot to the other sectors. I don't think we've seen really convincing use cases yet in other industries. And just coming back to what Nicole said, I think this will take some time. I mean, it's a major shift in technology, and when have we seen something like that before? We could go back to the Industrial Revolution or maybe somewhat in between. The point is, yes, of course, 100 years later, everybody was much, much better off because of the Industrial Revolution, right? No question. But it took a long time to get there. It took a few kind of wars in between to sort things out, and we had new social movements. So what I'm trying to say is that AI phenomenon has the potential to disrupt in the short term, very, very big time, so to speak. It's going to put a lot of people out of jobs, presumably. It's going to raise productivity, but only for those who have still a job. And the follow-up wave of then new job creation that uses AI in a new way that we can't even think about. Yeah? Who would have thought of Uber like 150 years ago when the car was just invented? That will take time. So it's a big disruptor. And how this is being handled with the US and China now kind of very close in terms of leading the whole thing, but also being geopolitical opponents, thinking about how to utilize that for warfare and the like. I don't want to make a prognosis here how long this will take and whether it's going to be peaceful.
So, a final minute we have here, I want to ask you the question we always end with, which is, what would make a successful meetings? When we reconvene at the end of this week and talk about how the meetings went, what's the one item we should look for to say this was successful?
Yeah, two things. One, quickly, another focus on AI activity is the concentration risk that colleagues have not raised. In the first half of this year, AI-related hardware, software, data centers purchases contributed 1.1% of the 1.6% growth of the US economy. That's huge. And there are many signs that that activity is slowing down. So that risk, I think, go into my assessment of what is the risk of my stagflation. What do we expect? Basically, what I want to see, and I probably will see, is that the wheel will be kept turning going forward. And if the meeting achieves that, that is big achievement given the circumstances.
Martin?
Well, I wrote today that much of what's going to happen is happening behind the scenes. So I'm not sure whether we already know by the end of the week what really kind of came out of these meetings.
We'll try to share with everyone what we hear.
But of course, we'll see, and I would expect hopefully a positive chairman statement or chairwoman statement. But otherwise, I don't expect too much in terms of announcements. So, we'll have to kind of write about that, I think, after that week in our various blogs and publications about what really happened.
We have the head of the
scenes.
IMFC, the chair of the IMFC, the Saudi finance minister with us tomorrow, so we can ask this question of him. Nicole?
Yeah, I think I'm with my colleagues here. It's a steady as she goes. I don't want to say do no harm, but everyone kind of coming out unscathed. And I think for me, maybe there's one thing is a shift in the narrative, towards a forward-looking narrative, and like I said, hearing from sort of new voices that can hopefully carry some momentum forward, bridging some of that foreign affairs and finance tracks.
No, I'm glad you ended with that. And I want to just take a moment and thank everyone in advance for joining us this week, and thank you, Nicole, Martin, and Hung. But I also want to take a moment of personal privilege. When we reconvened 2 years ago in Marrakesh, it was October 8th, a day after war broke out between Israel and Hamas. And seeing what has happened today, the beginning of the Phase 1 deal, long awaited, obviously many steps to go, but finally, at least we hope, the beginning of peace for now in that region, I think reminds us of what we are all trying to do here in this world of multilateral development and finance, which is prosperity, yes, but prosperity in pursuit of peace. Ultimately. And sometimes we forget that, and I think we always see it as our job at the Atlantic Council to bridge those worlds together, as you said, Nicole. So please continue to join us throughout the week at the Atlantic Council. We start tomorrow with an event on sovereign debt at the Council, and then here at 10 a.m. we have a fascinating event inside the making of a Trump trade deal with two former Trump trade negotiators. My colleague Sophia Bush will moderate that event. And then we go with a heavy lineup throughout the day. The Irish Central Bank Governor, the Saudi Finance Minister, many more. You can find the full agenda on the Atlantic Council website. We look forward to seeing you. We wish everyone an excellent and successful and productive week.